Welcome to our channel. Get ready for a collection of incredible stories that will send shivers down your spine. If you love mystery and horror, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more thrilling content. Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's dive into the stories. It couldn't be said that he had surrendered completely, but his state was something close to that. Without saying a word, she grabbed Philip by the hand and dragged him back up the stairs. Completely confused, he managed to take one last glance at those he had descended with. Their expressions shifted from bewildered fear to something that seemed almost understanding. It was as if they had exhaled, realizing that the one now dragging Philip back up the steps had no quarrel with them. She clearly held authority over them or, at the very least, stood higher in the local hierarchy. As their silhouettes disappeared around the bend of the staircase, Philip, who had first felt the detachment of the doomed but was now filled with a growing sense of hope, found the courage to ask without hesitation, "Missed me that much? Is that why you were in such a hurry?" She didn't respond. But Philip could feel it. She tensed, as if seized by a fit of powerless rage. As though she had bristled, her form contorting, sprouting sharp spines between her vertebrae like a porcupine preparing to face a leopard. The realization, which he hoped was not mistaken, only strengthened the hope swelling in his chest. Something inside him whispered, like a conspiratorial voice in his ear, that the one leading him up the stairs, clutching his wrist with painfully tight fingers, not that he even noticed, deeply disliked what was happening. That is, if this thing, merely disguised as a girl, was even capable of such feelings. After several flights, she yanked him into the corridor he had seen not long ago and led him toward the familiar elevators. Passing by the moaning, weeping bodies, Philip walked as if in a trance, though this time, it wasn't them that captivated him, but rather the anticipation of something so profound that it dwarfed everything he had experienced over the past harrowing hours. Would overshadow all the horrors and events that, until recently, he would have thought impossible to conceive in a sane mind. She shoved him into one of the elevators and stepped in after him. Perhaps she spoke during their ascent in the steel cabin, but if she did, he didn't hear a word. And yes, they were ascending. The knowledge of it rang like a bell in his consciousness, amplifying his impatient, yet now completely fearless, expectation. But Philip sensed, this was not the climax yet. Something still had to happen. Something that would place the final pieces of the puzzle, erase all doubts. That would either save him, though he couldn't imagine how, or, he preferred not to consider the alternative, destroy his last hopes. The elevator doors opened, abruptly cutting off his thoughts. His companion seized his wrist again and dragged him out, shoving aside those waiting for their turn, those who had no idea what awaited them below, or, if they were lucky, above. Philip had no doubts about her destination. She was taking him back to the ward. The only question was, why? It was obvious this wasn't planned. Everything was happening with a strange urgency. She led him into the ward, shut the door behind them, and, for the first time since leaving the elevator, released his hand. She froze, staring at him from under her brows. Despite his sense of anxious anticipation, though he didn't know for what exactly, and despite thinking he had drained his personal reservoir of fear, her new gaze frightened him. It was not the same look she had given him when she descended the stairs minutes earlier. The fiery rage she had barely contained back then was gone. Now her eyes bore into Philip with cold, almost resigned hatred. The way, perhaps, a prisoner, exhausted from years behind cold iron bars, might look at the judge handing down a life sentence. When the verdict itself is less important than the question of when he will finally be transferred to a real prison, with conditions at least slightly better than his current hell. Yet even so, when the judge speaks the expected sentence, it crushes the prisoner's last flickering hopes he may have kept buried deep in his tormented mind. That was how this creature, still pretending, for some reason, to be human, looked at Philip now. "Get in bed. I assume you still remember how that's done?" it said. And for a moment, behind the cold mask of hatred, a mocking, artificial smirk flickered on its face, matching its words. Without thinking, barely processing the meaning, Philip obeyed. He had the overwhelming sense that if he hesitated, the creature might change its mind, and something crucial. Something undeniably important and, he was now sure, something good, might slip away. So he stretched out on the hard mattress, arms at his sides, and stared at the creature with reverent anticipation. At last, it moved again. Slowly, it approached and placed its hand on his forehead. Strangely, even now, and later when he tried to recall the moment, Philip could never determine whether that hand had been cold or warm. The girl leaned in close to his ear, eyes staring past him, beyond him, and began to speak, her voice slow and deliberate. Everyone's always in a rush. Rushing only causes problems. Rushing never leads to wisdom. Time and time again, I see this. And here we are again. But as they say, it happens to the best of us. Fine. Let's say that's true. But don't get your hopes up. Those two idiots who dragged you here are already getting what they deserve. They're being repaid in full, right now, for all their haste and all their so-called divine blessings. At these words, the creature let out a hoarse chuckle. Its voice, already dropping to lower tones without Philip realizing, now sounded almost masculine. It seemed the creature was finally beginning to shed its disguise. After all, it was saying goodbye to Philip. The need to pretend was losing its purpose. But as for you, I'll say it again, don't celebrate, it murmured, running one now rough finger over Philip's forehead. Because, I promise you. At these words, it leaned in, pressing its already decaying lips almost against his ear. We will meet again. These were the last words it spoke before withdrawing its hand from Philip's forehead. Then, suddenly, it straightened and struck his forehead with its palm. The world blurred, spinning wildly in Philip's eyes, stripping away all sharpness and detail. And perhaps, in a way, this saved his mind from the overwhelming terror that would have haunted him for an immeasurable time had he gotten one last, clear look at the thing that had only moments ago still worn a human mask. But to say Philip saw nothing would be a mistake. Even in the disorienting whirlpool that had consumed his vision, he still caught a glimpse of what had moments ago gripped his wrist with human-like fingers. And as the horrific truth revealed itself, distorted but undeniable, Philip screamed. Then, convulsing in a panic-stricken fit, he plunged into the safety of unconsciousness. Opening his eyes, Philip didn't immediately understand where he was. The small, light-colored room resembled a hospital ward. In fact, it was one. A strange sense of déjà vu washed over him. He had no understanding of why he was here. Moreover, he had the strong impression that this was far from his first day in this place. The numerous tubes and devices attached to his frail body testified to that. His physical condition also hinted at the same thing. He had clearly been here for quite some time. The realization of what had happened came later, piecing itself together from fragmented memories and the doctor's explanations. For now, he simply watched as a nurse, who had just peeked into his room, widened her eyes in shock before darting back into the corridor with only a startled hello, blurting from her lips. Soon, doctors surrounded his bed, fussing over him. Their scattered remarks, impossible, born under a lucky star, and the classic I swear, this guy just had his second birthday, were accompanied by the same wide-eyed disbelief on each of their faces. After that, Philip was wheeled away somewhere, transferred from one bed to another, subjected to various tests, some of which were far less unpleasant than others. The simplest neurological assessments, like touching his finger to the tip of his nose, were unexpectedly painful due to the multiple fractures riddling his body. There's no need to describe the entire timeline of his physical recovery after the catastrophic injuries he had suffered. Suffice it to say that throughout his prolonged hospital stay, which stretched over several months, Philip was frequently tormented by strange visions and inexplicable thoughts. He struggled to articulate them clearly to the psychologist assigned to his case. It wasn't until long after his discharge, when he had mostly healed, at least physically, and had come to terms with the accident, that certain realizations began to take shape in his mind. The air was cooling again, and autumn crept closer, promising to be even colder than the last. By then, Philip had reconstructed the full sequence of events. he remembered the emergency call. The race against time to save a drug addict overdosing. He could still hear Anne Reich swearing behind the wheel, torn between speeding to their destination and keeping the ambulance steady on the icy roads. Philip mentally traced every step of that fateful night. Then, he recalled the moment he first opened his eyes, after 6 long days of unconsciousness, startling the evening shift nurse so much that she barely managed a stammered hello before bolting to fetch the head doctor. But something else lingered in his mind. Something he had initially dismissed as false memories. Over time, however, his doubts grew. A persistent thought nagged at him: there had been something more. Something strange. Something almost wild. Events that, logically, could only be hallucinations brought on by head trauma, by a brain deprived of oxygen and swollen from injury. For a long time, Philip reassured himself that the fragmented images haunting his nightmares were nothing but illusions. They couldn't be real. And yet, more and more often, he found himself questioning the religious beliefs he had once accepted without doubt. He had been raised by a deeply faithful mother, and until recently, he had never had reason to challenge those convictions. Now, however, he noticed his own lips curling into a smirk during church sermons. His skeptical expression earned him disapproving glances from the congregation as the priest spoke of heaven and salvation. Since his discharge, his mother had dragged him to church regularly, insisting on showing gratitude for what she called a miracle from God. According to her, divine intervention had saved him. But Philip wasn't so sure. Miracle or something else? Whatever had saved him, he wasn't in a hurry to offer his thanks. Something clung to his soul like a lingering stain, creeping deeper with each passing day. He found himself questioning everything he had once held sacred, especially the promise of salvation. The very principles that had guided his life, that had led him to choose a career dedicated to helping others, suddenly seemed uncertain. Until one night, months after leaving the hospital, Philip was struck by a realization. At last, the puzzle pieces fit together. The fragmented memories, the ones he had dismissed, finally formed a complete picture. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to truly remember. And when he did, he laughed bitterly and finally spoke aloud the question that had been haunting him all this time: do I even want that kind of heaven? Seriously, am I really willing to pay such a terrible price for it? Pulling the blanket around himself, he fell asleep almost instantly, for the first time in ages. Relief, bitter as it was, allowed him to rest. And that night, and in all the nights that followed, the nightmare that had tormented him throughout his recovery never returned. The nightmare in which he found himself lost in a swirling vortex of shifting objects, his surroundings twisting into a chaotic blur. The nightmare in which, to his left, something loomed over him. Something that had once resembled a petite girl, but no longer did. The rotting mouth, dripping thick saliva mixed with yellow pus. The coarse, festering skin, breaking apart to reveal glimpses of something beneath, a face no longer human, something more akin to a rat's visage. And all of it accompanied by the cacophony of wailing and cries echoing from below, from the lower floors. The very sounds he hadn't noticed back then, too absorbed in his own thoughts. But one sound had stood out, clear and unmistakable. A voice. Repeating, over and over, growing louder each time. We will meet again. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time.